The words and the formality of the language we choose to use is often based on our relationship to the people we talk to. Now, this can be difficult if English isn't your first language. How do you know if you're unintentionally being too informal or even offensive? In this episode, we're going to look at some expressions that you may have heard in TV series, films, or maybe from native speakers, and we'll give you some more polite alternatives that you can use just to be on the safe side. Welcome to
Aprender Inglés con Reza y Craig.
Hello, and if you're a new listener to the podcast, you're very, very welcome. My name's Craig.
And my name's Reza.
And together with more than 50 years of teaching English between us, Reza and I are going to help you improve your English and take it to the next level, the next polite level. Hello, Reza, how are you?
Thank you very much for asking. I feel quite well. And your good self?
Well, thank you for asking me. I'm feeling very, very well and excited to be podcasting about being polite this week. But before we start with that, we want to remind you that we're nearly at episode 500. 2 more to go. We're on episode 498 at the moment. And we would like to know what has been your favourite podcast episode so far. We will share ours on episode 500, and we thought it would be really nice to share your voices and your opinions on that podcast. So to send us your voice messages, go to speakpipe.com, that's speakpipe.com/Ingles podcast. And by doing this, you will help us to create better podcasts in the future by telling us what you have liked in the past.
So, Craig, shall we start off with a voice message?
Yes, we've heard from Javi from Madrid, who has some comments about his best British comedy series of all time. Here's Javi.
Hello Reza, hello Craig, this is Javi from Madrid. It's been a while since I sent you my last message, so I'm not sure if you remember me. The topic I want to bring up today is British series. I hope you haven't talked about it yet. The thing is, I've watched a massive number of British series and I quite like the humor and the quality of them. My top 3 would be the following: The In-Betweeners, This Country and Utopia, despite the fact this one was called off. I'd love it if you could also share with us your top 3. Thank you for all the great work you do. I'm getting closer and closer to having listened to all your episodes. Bye bye.
Well, thank you, Javi, for your message. And of course, we remember you. It's been a while since you sent us a message. But yes, your messages are always very clear and with wonderful expressions and vocabulary, like a massive number that you've watched. Now, I must apologize, Javi, because I did misinterpret your question. When I heard the word humor, I assumed that you wanted us to think about our top 3 comedy British TV series, and I didn't know about The In-Betweeners, This Country, Utopia. I'd never seen any of those, although I did see yesterday an episode of The In-Betweeners, which I really liked, and it was comedy. So I just assumed you wanted our comedy list. So we'll tell you our top 3 comedy British TV series, and then we'll mention 1 or 2 others that are not comedies that we actually like. So, Reza, what are your top 3 comedy TV shows from Britain?
For me, the top 3 of all time, not necessarily recent series, are Fawlty Towers, which stars John Cleese, a very well-known British comic actor. It's about a hotel with a kind of crazy, eccentric, unhinged, unbalanced owner. The 2 Ronnies, They're called that because the two main stars of that sketch show are called Ronald, Ronnie. And I particularly love their trademark, what they're famous for, their play on words. As someone who's interested in the English language, nobody does plays on words and comedy better than the two Ronnies. They're absolute masters.
In fact, if you go to YouTube and search for the two Ronnies, you'll see at the end of their show, they do what we do at the end of this podcast. And we took it from them. When I say it's goodbye from Reza and he said it's goodbye from Craig, we took that directly from the two Ronnies show.
That's right, they invented that. And also Monty Python's Flying Circus. I'm sure lots of you have heard of that. Yes, they're all very old. And yes, Monty Python's Flying Circus has a connection with Fawlty Towers because John Cleese is in both of them. Although there are other very famous actors such as Graham Chapman or Michael Palin, etc., who are in Monty Python's Flying Circus. I'm only allowed to choose 3, so they're my 3. But I would give an honourable mention for The Office, which I know Craig likes as well, and one which not so many foreigners will know called Blackadder. That goes way back to the 1980s that started. I think it ran for about 15 or 20 years, starring Rowan Atkinson, who would later go on to do Mr. Bean and several other things. That was very funny. But since we were a bit confused, Javi, about your message, I noticed that you mentioned Utopia. Utopia is not a comedy program. If it's the series I'm thinking of, it was very dark, but you've really impressed me with your choice because it's also one of my favorite British series of all time. And I've met very few people who've even heard of it. So if you're talking about the same series as me, Utopia, that's not comedy, but I'm also a big fan. Now, isn't that an incredible coincidence? Anyway, Craig, back to you and the comedy. What's your choice?
Well, before my choice, I want to mention that Javi said Utopia was called off. I wouldn't use that phrasal verb when a TV series is not renewed for another season. I would say it's cancelled or discontinued. And that's a question of collocation. We call off meetings, we call off an agreement, we call off a sporting event like the football match has been called off because of the weather. We call off a press conference. But speaking about a TV series, if there's no more money, if it's not successful, then it's just been cancelled or discontinued. And yeah, my top 3 comedies, very similar to Reza, with one extra addition at number 1, Only Fools and Horses, which has comedy very specific around the London area, which is where I'm from. Lots of London slang and characters in there from me growing up. My local pub and my childhood reminds me a lot of that around the comedy. The Office, as well, as Reza mentioned, because The Office, the British version of The Office, not the American version, the British version was one of the first, I think, mockumentaries where it's filmed in a documentary style, but it's funny. And I thought Ricky Gervais's interpretation of a situation comedy or a sitcom was very original with The Office. I agree with Reza, Fawlty Towers is definitely in my top 3, and I will give an honorary mention for Monty Python's Flying Circus because they really started a different way of looking at comedy in Britain, and definitely with satire and that kind of thing. So yeah, those are my top 3. Although because we've just realised, Javi, that your list was general British TV series and not only comedy, Reza, what would you add to your list that isn't typically funny?
Well, as I've already mentioned, Utopia, which is far from funny. It's very dark. Apart from that, British series, I can't think of many right now, to be honest.
I'll mention my 3 and you can have a think. I really like police dramas, and the 3 that come to mind, Line of Duty, I thought was very, very good and quite realistic, I think, about how the police work in the UK. Happy Valley is another very gripping. Gripping means it takes your attention. You want to know what happens next. Very exciting series. and one that's probably close to Reza's heart, The Fall, which is a police thriller that takes place in Belfast. So if you want to know where Reza's from, go and see The Fall. I think you'll enjoy it. Moving on to expressions that could be rude and impolite. But before we speak about those expressions, we would like to tell you how you can improve your English with us. Did you notice how polite that was? We would like to tell you. So, Reza, how can people improve their English by studying with you?
If it's a one-to-one class that you're looking for, just you and the teacher, perhaps I can help. The advantage of a one-to-one class is that we get to focus on specifically what you want to focus on and also what I think you need. Speaking would probably be the main focus, but also if you think we need to dedicate time to specifically another area of English, such as grammar, vocabulary, reading, writing, listening, whatever, we can do that. And of course, there would be a lot of flexibility as regards the time of the class because we only have to make it suitable for both of us rather than a whole group. So that's the advantage of a one-to-one class, which I might be able to help you with. If you're interested, please do send me an email to belfastreza@gmail.com.
And we're nearly at the end of the year. We're recording this in December 2023. You might be making a New Year's resolution to improve your speaking and your communication in English. If that is the case, why not join one of my conversation courses where you can study with a small group of lovely students to improve your confidence, your fluency, your pronunciation, your vocabulary. And we have a lot of fun having discussions, debates, role plays, lots of fun activities based around speaking fluency. For more information, contact me at Craig, Craig, @inglespodcast.com and get your New Year's English off to a good start.
Now, let's get back to our main topic. Now, as we've said many times before, not knowing the topic that we're talking about hasn't really stopped us from talking about it.
What?
Indeed. For example, in the episode just before this one, we spoke about polyamory and swingers, and we don't know much about that. But this case is different. Finally, I get to talk about something which I know a hell of a lot about. That's being rude and impolite to people. I do know about that.
What?
I'm very good at that. So really, I'm like a fish in water here. I know what I'm talking about.
I thought you were going to say the opposite, that you're very polite and you know a lot about not being rude. But did you notice I said what twice to Reza? What?
That wasn't so polite, was it?
It wasn't so polite, but I think because our friendship has gone on for many years and we feel quite comfortable in each other's company and we know each other well, I think I could say to Reza, what? And I don't think, well, I hope he won't be offended. However, if you don't have that relationship with someone, if you're talking to a stranger or somebody at work, for example, there are other things you could use instead of what, aren't there, Reza? What are they?
You could say, for example, pardon, or even more formal and polite and a bit longer, I beg your pardon, or perhaps not so formal but definitely polite, I didn't catch that, or could you repeat that, or can you say that again? And with all of those, you can add the word please to be that little bit more formal, like could you repeat that please, or can you say that again please?
Now, in British and American TV series and films, you may have heard somebody saying to somebody else, shut up. That can be very rude, very impolite. If somebody's making a noise, just say, excuse me, could you please be quiet? Or could you make less noise? The collocation with noise is make. You make noise, so you ask someone politely to make less noise. You could also use the very, very useful expression, would you mind? But remember, you need a gerund if the verb follows mind, if you have a verb there. So, would you mind keeping it down, please? For example, imagine your neighbour's making a lot of noise, or the next room in your hotel, they're being very noisy. You knock on the door. Excuse me, would you mind keeping the noise down, please? Reza, have you ever asked a neighbour to make less noise or complained in a hotel?
In a hotel, not very often, but yes, I have at home because I have temporary neighbours at times who are quite noisy. This is the disadvantage of living opposite an Airbnb flat. So I quite often do have occasion to ask them to keep it down a bit, please.
Yeah, so remember not to say shut up. Use other expressions. And you can see these other expressions in the show notes to this episode at inglespodcast.com/498. Reza, what's the next expression that could be impolite and cause offense?
I would be careful about saying get lost to someone. That sounds really pretty strong to me. So it would have to be someone that you know very well, or you would have to be extremely angry with someone and have a lot of justification for saying get lost. It's advisable to say something like, please go away, you're bothering me. Or simply, would you mind leaving? Get lost is very direct and would upset some people, I think. Don't you think so?
Yeah, obviously with someone who you have a good relationship with, you could use it in a humorous way. I could say, oh, come on, Reza, get lost, and he wouldn't take it personally, but I'm using it sarcastically there. I'm not using it in a realistic way, but saying get lost to someone can be very, very insulting. Also, when you disagree with someone, you don't have the same opinion as them. If you just say you're wrong, that's very abrupt, it's very sudden. You need to soften it by apologizing first. For example, I'm sorry, but I think you're wrong, or you may be wrong, or you could be wrong. So you could use a modal verb to make it softer, or you can use the more formal, you may be mistaken, which is a more formal expression to say, no, you're wrong, I'm sorry.
It sounds better, doesn't it? Because you're focusing not on the fact that you're wrong, but the fact that you've made a mistake, and anybody can make a mistake. So it kind of sounds a little bit better for you. Not that you're wrong, simply you may be mistaken.
And in a similar way, I don't agree with you could be quite impolite. Maybe soften it with, I'm afraid I don't agree with you, or I'm sorry I don't agree with you, or use the alternative, I'm not sure about that. If you say I'm not sure about that, that means you don't necessarily agree with what you've heard.
Now, I'm sure all of you have been in conversation with someone who asked you things that you thought they shouldn't really ask you.
How old are you? How much money do you earn? Are you married?
Exactly. And if that person is someone that you know well, or you have a close relationship with, you might be able to say, mind your own business. Or maybe even, that's nothing to do with you. But if it's a stranger, or if it's someone you don't have such a close relationship with, then you would probably like to be more polite. So I suggest saying something like, I'd rather not answer that. Or you could hit their question with your own question. So when they say to you, hey, how old are you? You might say, why do you ask? Which is not really what you're saying. You're saying that you would prefer them not to ask. And hopefully they get the message. Why do you ask?
I like that because you're throwing the question back to the other person to make them think. And then all of a sudden, they're on the defensive. Why did I ask that question? What? So it puts them in the situation that you were in before. So I really like that way of dealing with awkward questions that it isn't the business of the person to ask you if you're married. So you say, well, why do you ask? And then they need to answer your question.
Craig, what do you think about, in general, using imperatives? Things like, give me, show me, take me, do this, make that, come, go. What do you think about that? Is that polite?
Can be impolite, especially if you don't know the person well. And again, all of these expressions depend on your relationship with the person you're talking to. So to be clear, an imperative is where you've got the verb without to. So as Reza said, give me, take me, show me. Yeah, that could be quite impolite. I prefer to use do you mind that I mentioned earlier with the gerund, the ing form of the verb you need. For example, would you mind giving me a lift to the station? Would you mind taking me to the nearest bank? Would you mind showing me your latest photographs? Much more polite.
Another possibility is to use do you think you could? So instead of give me that torch, you might say, do you think you could give me that torch? Or take me to the doctor. Do you think you could take me to the doctor, please? Sounds much better. But if you want to save time, if you're in a bit of a hurry and you don't want to use too many words, simply just put in the word please just before the imperative. So imagine you want to say what you've got to say quickly, but instead of just saying give me that, if you just add that one little word, please give me that, then it sounds a hell of a lot better. The word please softens it a lot and you're much more polite now simply by putting either at the beginning, please give me that, or at the end, give me that please. Please helps a hell of a lot.
And who would you use just the imperative with? I mean, I don't think, even without close relationship, that you would say to me, pass the salt or give me a beer from the fridge. You'd probably soften it. I don't know how you'd speak to your family. Would you use the imperative with them?
With my family, I'd probably say can with please.
Can you please?
Can you give me a beer, please? Or can you pass me the salt, please? I think for family, that's for a British or Irish family, that's good enough. Can with a please. Can you blah, 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 please? That's polite enough, isn't it? That should keep people happy if you know them.
Please and thank you are required, I think, in most British houses. Now, do you think you could, or would you mind? They are used to make indirect and polite questions in English, and we have spoken about those before, so we'll stop there. Just go to inglespodcast.com/345 and you can learn more about these indirect polite requests. And we also spoke about them with our friend Nicola, didn't we, Reza?
That's right. I remember she was speaking about traveling to Morocco and other things and her time in Africa, in Benin and places like that. But we focused on the grammatical structures of indirect questions, partly to be polite. That's episode 50. So go to inglespodcast.com/50.
Wow, that was nearly 450 episodes ago, Reza.
And how many years ago? About 4 or 5 years ago? My goodness.
No more.
More than
probably
that.
six or seven.
2013, 7 or 8 years ago.
7 or 8 years ago.
Yeah. Wow.
How time passes. Speaking of passing, you can say that someone's dead. Oh, my grandmother's dead, or my neighbour's dead. But it does sound quite direct. It's much softer, much nicer to use the phrasal verb to pass away. So unfortunately, my dog passed away last week. We don't like to talk about death, so we have lots of euphemisms and other words for death. And possibly the most common one is to say that someone has passed away. They're no longer with us.
These are very important expressions, particularly for some people. For example, I don't know if any of our listeners are perhaps doctors or nurses or even vets treating animals. You don't want to say to a relative, oh, your mum's dead. You simply can't do it that way. Who knows, you might deal with an English-speaking patient sometimes. So it is really important to know these expressions and say to someone, for example, I'm very sorry, but your mother has passed away. They're the sort of things that doctors have to say, whether they like it or not. They're difficult, but you have to say it. So say it in the most polite way possible.
And I know that we do get some English teachers listening to this podcast. So a word of advice, if a student comes into class one day and said, I'm sorry I'm late, my grandmother died, don't correct the student's grammar and say, no, it's better to say passed away. Just say, oh, I'm really sorry to hear that. Learn from my mistakes. Now, the next one, you can be fired from a job or sacked by your former employer, but there are more polite ways to say that, Reza, aren't there?
Yes, probably the most common one is to lay someone off. So if...
Is it the same though? Because if someone lays you off, is that your fault or is that the company's economical situation? Is it like to be made redundant?
It could be, which isn't exactly the same, is it, as fireside? For me, lay off is ambiguous. If the boss says to you, we're going to have to lay you off, it could be because he's sacking you because you've done something that you shouldn't have. Or it could be that it's an economic question. I think lay off is kind of ambiguous. It may be because you deserve it, or it may be that you don't deserve it, but it's just bad luck. For me, it kind of covers both areas.
Though I think made redundant is definitely you lose your job because the company have decided that they cannot afford to pay you. They have to reduce costs. So made redundant, in my opinion, is definitely not your fault. It's the company's fault.
I've thought of another one which is a little bit ambiguous. It could be the meaning of to make someone redundant, or it could be the meaning of sack you, but done in a polite way. If the boss wants to sack you, but in a polite way, he might say, I'm afraid I'm going to have to let you go. That can be a polite way of sacking you. I'm going to have to let you go, but they're sacking you, really.
And you say, why is that? And he says, because you're too heavy. Shown the door. I'm afraid we're going to have to show you the door. Here's the door. I would use, to let someone go, to make someone redundant, or to lay someone off. Speaking of employment, unemployed is okay. It's clear, but I would not say I'm unemployed. I would not say I'm on the dole, which is a very British expression to say you're claiming from the government because you don't have a job. I prefer the expressions, I'm between jobs, or I'm looking for work at the moment, especially if you're going on a job interview. I'm between jobs and I'm looking for work.
They just sound more positive, don't they? If you're looking for work, that's good. You might be given a job soon, but unemployed doesn't transmit the idea that you're actually looking for work. Maybe you're not.
It's not proactive.
Yeah. Now, the word toilet is a word which can be used, particularly in a neutral or technical way, but there are more polite ways of talking about the toilet. You've got the men's room or the ladies' room, of course, depending on your sex. The men's room or the ladies' room. But then again, I may have just opened a can of worms, Pandora's box. I said, depending on your sex, but of course, these days you get unisex toilets as well for men and ladies. So you don't want to offend somebody by saying, where's the men's room, please? And they might get all offended and say, oh, here it's a unisex toilet. We don't distinguish between men and women. But as a general rule of thumb, that means for most occasions, if you're a man, say, where's the men's room? And if you're a woman, say, where's the ladies' room? Or if you wish to point someone in that direction, you say, the men's room is over there, or the ladies' room is over there. It's not normal to say, the unisex toilet is over there. It doesn't sound as polite, does it?
No, but if you want to be gender non-specific, you could say, excuse me, where's the bathroom? You're not going to take a bath, but you want to know where you can go to relieve yourself. Another word you could use is the restroom. The restroom, which is quite common in American English. So, excuse me, where's the restroom, please?
And what if you wanted to be polite in a euphemistic way, because you don't even want to mention what you have to do in the toilet? You might say something like the little boys' room, as if only little boys go there. Not men. Men don't go there. Only little boys. It's a kind of a very British, polite, silly way of saying the toilet. Can you tell me where the little boys' room is? Or you'll find that the powder room for ladies, the powder room is over there. Why do they say the powder room, Craig?
Because ladies sometimes like to powder their noses. You could also say that you need to spend a penny, because years ago, back in the day, way, way, way back, you used to pay a penny to go to a public toilet. So to spend a penny is a euphemism for going to the toilet. Excuse me, where can I spend a penny?
Craig, if I were rude, and let's be honest, sometimes I am, I might well say...
Very rarely.
From time to time, I might say, you know what, Craig, I'm hungry. I want to eat. Could I say that in a more polite way?
This is something I hear many students saying, I want instead of I'd like. I would like is much more polite than I want. And we often contract the would. So you hear I'd like. So much more polite if Reza said, excuse me, Craig, I'd like to eat if that's possible. I'd like to eat soon. I'm quite hungry.
And what if you wanted to offer me some food? What would you say to offer it?
To you, I'd say, do you want? But again, want in the wrong relationship could be impolite. It's much nicer to say, would you like? So you'll probably hear that in a restaurant, in a shop. Would you like the bill, sir? Would you like another glass of wine? Would you like to pay now, sir? So you'd use that would you, much more polite than do you want.
And in shops in general, imagine you're a shop assistant and you want to help a customer. It doesn't sound good if you say, what do you want? It almost sounds like you want the person to leave. I've occasionally heard shop assistants say that to people, and it was kind of like a euphemistic code for them to say, to imply, we want you to leave, to people that they thought were maybe going to rob the shop or something. So if the shop assistant says to you, what do you want? They don't like you. It's pretty clear, yeah? Normally they would say, how can I help you?
What do you want? They stress the you. What do you want? You again. Using the passive makes something polite simply because you're often removing the agent from the sentence. I'm not talking about 007. There's no James Bond here. The agent is the person who does the action. So, for example, Susan gave me the wrong information. Well, that's not very nice. You're blaming Susan. If you change that to the passive, which would be I was given the wrong information, maybe it was obvious that it was by Susan, but you don't say that. You don't mention her name. So often changing to the passive makes your sentence more polite. I was given the wrong information. Can you think of another example?
Imagine our friend Harry has to sign a contract, but he hasn't because he's very forgetful. Well, we could say Harry hasn't signed the contract yet, but that makes Harry look bad. It sounds a bit impolite. So let's take away the subject. Let's take Harry out of the equation. Make it passive. The contract hasn't been signed yet. So by doing it that passive way, indirectly, it's more polite because it doesn't sound like I'm criticizing Harry. The contract hasn't been signed yet.
Imagine you're on a train in the UK or a bus or in a pub or sitting in a restaurant and somebody, not being very polite, tries to sit down next to you, but it's your friend's seat. What do you say? Well, you can say, my friend's using this seat. But again, if you change it to the passive, it's more polite. You can say, I'm sorry, this seat has been taken.
Imagine somebody says something which is simply not factually correct. You could say to them, your information is wrong, but wrong's a strong word. Wrong, the opposite of right, that's pretty black and white. So why not make it passive and be more polite and say something like, I'm afraid you've been misinformed. So you've been misinformed. That puts the blame somewhere else. So someone else has misinformed you. Don't worry, it's not your fault. You've been misinformed.
That reminds me of a scene in one of my favourite films, Casablanca, with Humphrey Bogart, where he's speaking to the Germans, to the Nazis, and they say, why did you come to Casablanca, Rick? And Rick says, I came here for the healthy spa waters. And one of the Nazis said, but there are no healthy spa waters in Casablanca. And Rick says, or Humphrey Bogart says, I was misinformed. The classic scene in one of my favourite films. Now, of course, you can also use rising intonation to make yourself sound more polite, and British speakers do that all the time. For example, I can say, is this seat free? Or I can say, is this seat free? Which sounds much more polite, doesn't it? Also, if you add excuse me at the beginning and you raise your voice at the end, you'll sound much more polite. Excuse me, is this seat free? Can you think of another example?
Yes, compare the monotonous delivery of this, can you repeat that, to the much more polite version of, can you repeat that, please?
Another example, what time's the next bus? Or, more polite, Excuse me, what time's the next bus? So my voice goes up and down.
What about the rather direct, where's the supermarket? Impolite version compared to, excuse me, where's this supermarket?
So now it's your turn to practice your English. We would love to hear from you. So please send us a voice message, especially because we're nearly at episode 500 and we want you to join us in the celebration. So what has been your favorite podcast episode so far? And we will include your messages in episode 500, which is coming up in 2 weeks. How can people send us their messages, Reza?
So give us your opinion about your favorite episode through a voice message. There's a link in the show notes to speakpipe.com/Ingles podcast. If you use them, you can leave a 90-second message for us to listen to. If you're still a bit shy and you don't want to leave a voice message yet, but we hope you do in the future, you could write an email to craig@inglespodcast.com or me, belfastreza@gmail.com.
And this podcast is sponsored in part by mansioningles.com. Why not visit the online store where you will see some courses and products to help you improve your English. The address for that is store, store.mansioningles.net.
As always, we'd like to say thank you very much to our Patreon supporters. And the people on the Patreon program, they donate as little as $1.50 per month to us. And as a way of saying thank you to them, we give them instant access to the audio transcriptions of this podcast. If you would like to get involved, why not follow the link in the show notes? It's patreon.com/Ingles podcast. And we would be very grateful for any help you might be able to give us.
And we can't mention everybody who is supporting us on Patreon, but we will say hello and thank you to our latest supporters this month. And they are Abel, Pedro Carrillo, Jose Maria Rodriguez, Juan Miguel Marabel González, Miguel M.R., Mr. Miguel, Raquel Muñoz Mayada, Aurora, and many thanks to Alejandro, who is sponsoring us for more than the minimum $1.50. Thank you to you and to everybody who is supporting us on Patreon.
Well, just before we go, I'd like to take the opportunity at the end of this episode about being polite to say, if you don't mind, that I would like to express my deepest gratitude and thanks to you for very, very conscientiously listening to us and giving us all your support. I've done that in the most polite way I could think of. In other words, thanks. Thanks for listening.
And on next week's podcast, Reza will not be with us, but we are going to speak to Stefania, who is a special guest next week, and she's going to talk about flying, aviation, airlines, pilots, flight attendants, air traffic controllers. She works as a flight attendant and she also helps people with their English if they're interested in getting a job in the aviation industry. So join us for that next week, or join me for that next week. Reza will be back in 2 weeks' time. Until then, have a wonderful week. Thank you for listening this week. It's goodbye from him.
And it's goodbye from me.
Music in this podcast was by Pitts. The track is called See You Later.